The day Warren Redmond buried his father, the sky over the Kansas plains turned the color of a bruise, and not a single cloud dared move across it, as though even the heavens had gone still with grief. It had been 3 days since that burial. 3 days since the small plot of earth behind the cottonwood tree received the body of Elias Redmond, who had built this homestead with cracked hands and a stubborn heart, who had hammered every plank of the porch Warren now sat upon, who had died quietly in his sleep without giving his son the chance to say goodbye. 3 days of dust and silence, and the slow ticking of the clock inside the house that Warren could not bring himself to wind again. 3 days during which the cattle had been fed by instinct and memory alone, during which the neighbors from the closest town, Caldwell, Kansas, had come and left their casseroles and their condolences and their awkward silences, and Warren had thanked them all with a voice that belonged to some other, more hollow version of himself. He was still sitting on that porch when Hester Beckett arrived. He heard her before he saw her. The soft clop of a single horse moving up the dirt trail that wound through the tall grass, steady and unhurried. He did not turn his head at first. He had stopped turning his head for much of anything these past 3 days. He sat in the old pine rocker his father had kept outside since Warren was a child, his forearms resting on his knees, his hat pulled low over his eyes, watching the brown earth of the yard with a kind of resigned blankness. His boots were still dusty from the funeral. Then the horse stopped at the gate post, and he heard the creak of the saddle as someone dismounted, and he heard the latch of the gate swing open, and he heard footsteps crossing the yard, and he lifted his eyes just far enough to see a pair of worn leather boots climb the 2 steps up onto the porch. A woman settled herself into the empty chair beside him, the one that had been his mother's before she passed 6 years prior, and she said absolutely nothing. Warren turned his head slowly and looked at her. Hester Beckett was 24 years old, with dark chestnut hair tucked under a sun-bleached straw hat and green eyes that were sharp without being unkind. He had known her for most of his life, the way you know someone in a small prairie town where everybody knows everybody, but not with any particular closeness. She had grown up the daughter of a dry goods merchant in Caldwell, had attended the same church socials he had attended, had traded pleasantries across the same dusty Main Street. She had left Caldwell 2 years ago when she took a position as a schoolteacher in a small neighboring settlement, and he had not thought about her with any real frequency during those 2 years. She was simply part of the landscape of his past, the way certain fence posts and creek bends were part of the landscape of the plains. She sat in his mother's chair with her hands folded in her lap and her hat brim shading half her face, and she looked out at the same brown yard he had been looking at, and she did not say a single word. After a long moment, Warren looked back at the yard too. And something about that silence, something about the simple fact that she had come all this way, 3 days after the funeral, without announcement and without explanation, and had simply sat down beside him without requiring anything from him at all, cracked something open inside his chest that all the kind words and covered dishes of the past 3 days had not been able to reach. He did not cry. He was not built for crying in front of people, and Hester Beckett seemed to understand that without being told. But the tightness in his shoulders eased, just slightly, like a rope given 1 inch of slack, and he breathed a breath that was almost normal, and the silence between them became something different than the silence that had surrounded him for 3 days. It became, somehow, company. She stayed until the sun began to lower itself toward the western horizon, and the light turned amber and long across the grass. Then she stood, settled her hat, and looked at him with those clear green eyes. "I will come back tomorrow," she said, and her voice was quiet and plain and did not ask for anything. It was a statement of fact, offered the way you might offer water to a man in a drought, without ceremony and without condition. Warren looked up at her and for the first time in 3 days gave a nod that meant something. She walked back across the yard, mounted her horse with the practiced ease of a woman who had ridden these plains her whole life, and rode back down the trail through the tall grass until the sound of hooves faded into the ordinary sounds of the Kansas evening. Warren sat on the porch for a while longer, and the ticking of the unwound clock inside the house seemed, for the first time, like something he might eventually be able to listen to again. Warren Redmond had turned 28 the previous February, on a day so cold that the water in the trough had frozen solid by morning, and he and his father had spent an hour breaking ice together before sharing a breakfast of black coffee and cornbread. That had been his birthday celebration, and he had not minded it. He was not a man who required much ceremony. He had grown up on this homestead, had learned to ride before he could read, had worked these acres since he was old enough to carry a pail, and had built his life around the rhythms of the land with a quiet contentment that most men in Caldwell respected even if they did not fully understand it. He had not married. There had been a woman once, Ruth Alderman, the daughter of the town's blacksmith, who had caught his eye for almost 2 years when he was in his mid-20s, and they had been close enough to an understanding that people in town had begun to speculate. But Ruth had wanted a life in a proper town, with a proper house on a proper street, and Warren had been unable to imagine himself anywhere but these acres, and so they had parted with a mutual sadness and no real bitterness, and Ruth had eventually married a banker and moved to Wichita, which seemed to suit her very well. After that, Warren had simply let the question of a wife settle into the background, like a tool you know you will need someday but can set aside for now. His father's health had begun its slow decline, and there had been enough to occupy him on the homestead without adding the complicated machinery of courtship to his days. Elias Redmond had been 61 years old when he died. Not an old man, not truly, but worn through in the way that men who spend 40 years working hard land tend to be worn. He had come to Kansas as a young man from Tennessee, had claimed this parcel under the Homestead Act of 1862 when it was still raw prairie with nothing on it but grass and wind and sky, and had built everything on it by hand over the course of a lifetime. He had been proud of it in the quiet, unsentimental way of men who show their love through labor rather than words. Warren had inherited that quality from him. He showed his love through labor. He fixed the fence before it needed fixing. He laid in extra firewood before the cold came. He kept the house in order not because he cared particularly about order, but because his mother and then his father had cared about it, and keeping it up was the only way he had of still being in conversation with them. So when Hester Beckett returned the following morning, as she had said she would, Warren was already at work in the yard, replacing a board on the south side of the barn that had warped over the winter. He heard her horse and did not stop hammering. She dismounted, tied her horse at the post, came into the yard and looked around at the homestead with the quiet, assessing gaze of someone who actually sees what they are looking at rather than simply looking. "Where does the fence need mending?" she asked. Warren looked up from his hammering. "I beg your pardon. The fence," she said, straightforward and unhurried. "I can see 2 posts on the north side leaning. You have got a lot to manage on your own right now. Where are the tools?" He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was somewhere between confused and something he could not quite name. No one had said that to him. Everyone else had offered words, food, prayers, sympathy. She was offering labor. "In the barn," he said at last. "Left side near the door." She nodded and went to get them. They worked through most of the morning without much conversation. Warren finished the barn board and moved on to checking the water trough for cracks. Hester worked the fence posts with a mallet and a steadiness that suggested she was not unfamiliar with such work, which surprised him somewhat, though he did not say so. Around mid-morning she paused and looked toward the house. "Have you eaten today?" "Coffee," he said. She set down the mallet and went inside without further comment. Warren kept working, and 20 minutes later she appeared in the doorway and called him in. And on the table there were biscuits and fried salt pork and scrambled eggs from his own henhouse, and a pot of coffee that smelled considerably better than the black sludge he had been making for himself these past 3 days. They sat across from each other and ate, and the conversation came in fits and starts, Nothing heavy, nothing that asked too much of him. She spoke about the school where she had been teaching, about a particular student who had finally, after 6 months of patient effort, managed to read a full page without stumbling. She mentioned that the road between her settlement and Caldwell had been graded recently and was considerably smoother for it. Small things, ordinary things, the kind of things you talk about when what you are really doing is keeping someone company in the only way they can currently tolerate. After a while, Warren said, "I did not expect you to come." Hester looked at him over her coffee cup. "Your father was a good man," she said simply. "He deserved to have someone sit with his son." Warren turned his cup in his hands. "You did not know him well." "Well enough," she said. "He came into my father's shop every spring for dry goods. He always asked after me by name, even after I had left Caldwell. He told my father he was proud of the school I was running." She paused. Men who notice young women doing good work and say so plainly without making it into something peculiar, those men are rarer than people think. Warren was quiet for a moment. "That sounds like him." "Yes," she agreed. "It does." The morning passed, then the afternoon. When the work was done and the light began to angle low, Warren walked her to her horse, and they stood in the yard with the September wind moving through the grass in long, slow waves. "You should not be making this ride in the dark," he said. "I was not planning to," she said, settling her boot into the stirrup. "I will see you Thursday." She swung up into the saddle and looked down at him. "You should wind the clock." He looked at her, startled. "It will help," she said. "It is not an insult to let the time keep moving." She touched the brim of her hat and rode away down the trail, and Warren stood in the yard and watched her go, and he thought about what she had said. And when he went inside that evening, he found the clock and wound it, and the ticking filled the house in a way that was not as bad as he had feared. She came back Thursday, and then the following Monday. And then it became a pattern without either of them formally declaring it to be one. Twice, sometimes 3 times a week, Hester Beckett would ride out from her settlement, and they would work on whatever the homestead needed and share a meal and talk in the easy, gradually deepening way of two people who are finding that the other person's company is something they have been missing without knowing it. October arrived, and with it the first real cold of the season, the kind that sweeps off the open plains and bites at your ears and makes the cattle bunch together in the corners of their paddock. The cottonwood behind the grave site dropped its leaves in a single night, as though all at once it had given up the effort of holding on, and Warren raked them back from the mound and stood there for a moment with the rake in his hand and looked at the 2 wooden markers that stood in the ground. His mother's, weathered and slightly tilted after 6 years. His father's, fresh and pale and terrible in its newness. He heard footsteps behind him and knew without looking that it was Hester. She stood beside him and looked at the 2 graves, and after a moment she reached out and straightened the older marker with both hands, pressing it gently back to upright and tamping the earth around its base with her boot. "Thank you," Warren said. "The ground shifts," she said practically, brushing the soil from her palms. "You have to check it every season." He nodded. "I will remember that." She looked at him from the side, and he could feel her looking at him the way you can feel the warmth of a fire without turning toward it. "Tell me about them," she said. "Your mother." No one had asked him that. They had asked about his father because Elia's was the recent loss, the fresh wound. But no one had thought to ask about his mother. "Clara," he said, and his voice changed when he said the name, became softer without his intending it. "She used to sing while she cooked. Old hymns, mostly. She had a beautiful voice, and she knew it, and she pretended she did not, which was one of the more endearing things about her. She grew tomatoes that won prizes at the county fair 3 years running. She read to me every night until I was 12, and then she read to herself, and you could always tell what kind of a book it was by whether she laughed or went quiet." He paused, surprised by how much he had said. "She died of fever 6 years ago last spring." "What was her favorite book?" The question startled a sound out of him that was almost a laugh. "She had about 15 copies of the same one worn down to nothing, a novel by Jane Austen. She gave me one of them when she got sick, said she wanted me to read it. I never did." He looked sideways at Hester. "Do not tell me I should have." "I was not going to say that," Hester said, and her mouth curved just slightly. "Though I will tell you it is very good. Have you read it?" "Every copy I could get my hands on," she said. "I taught a lesson from it last spring. My students thought it was very funny that the women were all trying so hard to get married." "Was it funny?" She looked back at the graves with a thoughtful expression. "Parts of it. Other parts I found more sad than funny. The women did not have a great many other options in that time and place. The men got to build things." She gestured briefly at the homestead around them, the fence and the barn and the house, all of it built by Redmond hands over 40 years. "The women got to hope the men they built things for turned out to be worth the hoping." Warren thought about that. "Is that why you became a school teacher? To build something yourself?" She turned and looked at him directly, and there was something in her eyes that was frank and serious in a way that was unusual for 1879, unusual for Kansas, unusual for a conversation in a field between two people who were, technically, not yet anything to each other at all. "Partly," she said, "and partly because I like children and I like books and I like knowing that, when I have done my day's work, something has been added to the world that was not there before. A child who could not read can read. That is a real thing. It does not disappear when I go home." Warren looked at her for a long moment. The wind moved her hair against her cheek and she put it back impatiently. The afternoon light was the color of old honey on her face. "That is more than most people can say," he said. She looked at him and something shifted in her expression, something that was not quite shyness but was something like it, a small private acknowledgement of having been seen. She looked back at the graves. "Yes," she said quietly, "I suppose it is." They walked back to the house together in the long prairie shadows, and Warren held the door open for her. And when she smiled at him in passing, it was the kind of smile that stays with a person long after the one who gave it has gone home. November came cold and earnest, and the homestead settled into its winter rhythms. Warren had a man from town, a young fellow named Roy Briggs who hired himself out for odd jobs, come twice a week to help with the heavier work, and that gave Warren a bit more breathing room, though not much. Running a homestead alone in winter was no small undertaking. Hester's visits had become, by now, the fixed stars of his week. He arranged his work around them without acknowledging to himself that he was doing so. He made sure the kitchen was reasonably presentable before she arrived. He had begun to keep a second coffee cup clean and ready on the shelf, a small unconscious ritual that he noticed one morning with a start of surprise, stood there looking at the cup for a moment, and then left it exactly where it was. On a Thursday in late November, she arrived looking tired in a way she was not usually tired, with shadows under her eyes that spoke of a difficult week. He did not ask immediately. He poured her coffee and set bread and butter on the table and let her sit quietly for a bit, in the same way she had let him sit quietly on the porch that first afternoon 3 months ago. After a while she said, "I had a difficult conversation with the town council in my settlement. About the school, about money for the school, about whether the school ought to continue at all in its current form. There is a man, Gerald Fitch, who has been on that council for 3 years and has decided that teaching children to read poetry and literature is a frivolity, and that the school should be reduced to arithmetic and practical letters. He has the ear of 2 other council members." She turned her coffee cup. "He also thinks a woman running the school is a temporary situation that should be remedied." Warren felt a slow, steady anger move through him. "What does the rest of the town think? The rest of the town is largely the parents of my students, and they have been very kind. But Gerald Fitch controls the funds. He has been cutting them back little by little, and this week he told me outright that he would recommend the school be closed unless certain changes were made." "What changes?" Her jaw tightened slightly. "That I limit the curriculum, and that I accept oversight from a male administrator." The anger in Warren solidified into something very clear and very quiet. "That is wrong," he said flatly. "Yes," she said, "it is." "What are you going to do?" She looked at him, and he could see that she had already decided. She was telling him not to ask his opinion, but because she needed someone to hear it said aloud. "I am going to speak at the next council meeting. I am going to present the records of my students' progress over the past 2 years, and I am going to present the letters of support that parents have written, and I am going to stand up in that room in front of Gerald Fitch and every other man in it and explain clearly why what I am doing has value." She paused. "And if they close the school anyway, I will find another way." Warren looked at her across the table, this woman with the clear green eyes and the unwavering spine, and felt something he had not felt for a very long time, something that was not simply affection or admiration but a deep, specific recognition, the feeling of seeing someone you did not know you were looking for and understanding with a sudden clean certainty that you have found them. He did not say any of that. He said, "When is the meeting?" "Next Friday." "I will come with you," he said. "If you want." She looked at him. "You do not need to do that." "I know," he said. "Do you want me to?" A pause. Outside, the wind moved along the side of the house with a low sound. The clock ticked. "Yes," she said. "I think I would." The council meeting was held in the back room of the settlement's general store on a Friday evening when the cold was sharp enough to make the walk from the hitching post to the door feel like a small ordeal. Warren sat in the second row with his hat in his hands and his back straight, and he watched Hester Beckett stand at the front of that room and present her case with a steadiness and precision that made several of the council members shift uncomfortably in their seats. She had prepared well. She had a ledger with attendance figures and letters from 15 families, written in various levels of literacy, all saying the same thing in different ways. This school and this teacher mattered. She spoke for 20 minutes without notes and without pausing, and when Gerald Fitch interrupted her twice with dismissive remarks, she waited each time until he was finished and then continued exactly where she had left off, as though the interruptions were small stones thrown in a river and she was the river. When she was done, there was a silence in the room, and then several people in the audience began to speak, parents and farmers and a woman who ran the settlement's only boarding house, all in Hester's favor, and Gerald Fitch's expression grew tighter and more unpleasant with each one. The vote at the end of the meeting was 4-1 in favor of maintaining the school in its current form. Gerald Fitch was the one. On the ride home that night, they traveled together through the dark and the cold, their horses moving at an easy walk on the familiar road. The stars over the Kansas plains were extravagant, the way they always were in winter, sharp and thick and indifferent to anything happening below them. "You were magnificent in there," Warren said. "I was prepared," she said, and he could hear the smile in her voice even without seeing her face in the dark. "That is what magnificent means," he said. She was quiet for a moment and then she laughed, a real laugh, unguarded and warm, and it rang out into the cold night air and he felt it like sunlight. "I am glad you came," she said. "I told you I would," he said. They rode in easy silence for a while, and Warren was aware, with a clarity that felt new and important, of how right this felt. Riding through the dark beside her, side by side on a cold November road. Not performing anything, not demonstrating anything, just being, the two of them, in the plain, honest fact of each other's company. When they reached the fork where their routes parted, they stopped their horses and faced each other in the dark. He could see the pale shape of her face under the brim of her hat and the small cloud of her breath in the cold air. "Hester," he said, and his voice came out lower and more deliberate than he had intended, like something he had been holding and was setting down carefully. "Yes." He looked at her. His heart was doing something complicated in his chest. He was not a man who said things before he was certain of them, and he was not entirely certain yet, or rather he was certain in a way that frightened him slightly, that felt too large for the ordinary words he had at his disposal. "Ride safe," he said at last. "The road gets icy past the creek." There was a pause, and in that pause he felt that she had heard both the thing he had said and the thing he had not said. She had always been good at that, better than anyone he had ever known. "I always do," she said softly. And then she turned her horse and rode south, and he sat for a moment watching her go before turning east toward home. December settled in with full, unambiguous cold, and the homestead went into its winter mode. More indoor work, more planning for spring, the long, quiet evenings by the fire that in previous years Warren had shared with his father. Those evenings were different now, quieter in a different way. He had taken to reading in the evenings, which was not something he had done much in his adult life. He had found his mother's worn copy of the Austen novel on the shelf, and had started it more than once before getting properly into it. But by December, he was genuinely in the middle of it and found, to his mild surprise, that he understood what his mother had loved about it. It was about paying attention. The whole book was about paying attention carefully enough to understand what was actually true, underneath all the noise that people made to obscure the truth from themselves and everyone around them. He thought about that a good deal. He thought about Hester Beckett. On a Wednesday in mid-December, she arrived with her saddlebag full of Christmas things, small items she had brought as gifts for the homestead. A tin of good tea, a new cake of soap that smelled like cedar, a small wreath of dried prairie flowers she had made herself. She hung the wreath on the front door with a nail she found in the porch, and Warren stood in the doorway watching her and felt something accumulate in his chest that was becoming too large and too specific to leave unnamed for much longer. They made supper together that evening, which they had done before but which felt different tonight. The two of them moving around the small kitchen with the easy coordination of people who know each other's habits, handing things back and forth without needing to ask. The lamp warm on the table, and the fire warm in the hearth, and the wreath hanging on the door outside. When supper was done and the dishes cleared and the tea made, Warren sat across from her with his cup and said, with the deliberate plainness of a man who has decided to stop hedging, "I have been thinking about you constantly for 2 months." Hester looked at him. Her hands were wrapped around her cup and the firelight moved on her face. "I know," she said quietly. "You know. I am a school teacher," she said, and there was a soft wryness in her voice. "I pay attention to people." "And," he said. She looked at him steadily, without playing at confusion or false modesty. She was not built for those games, and neither was he, and they both knew it. "And I have been thinking about you too," she said, "constantly for roughly the same period of time." A pause, possibly longer. Warren set down his cup carefully. The fire crackled, the clock ticked. Outside, the prairie wind moved along the eaves with its low, persistent sound. "Hester," he said, "I need you to understand something about me before we go further with this because I think it matters." "Tell me then," she said, and her voice was steady. "I am not going to leave this land," he said. "This homestead, these acres. My father built this. My mother is buried here. I am going to spend my life working this ground, and I cannot imagine doing otherwise. I know that is not what every woman wants. I know Ruth Alderman." He saw her flicker of recognition at the name. The settlement gossip traveled. "I know that was the thing that ended that. And I am not telling you this to give you an obstacle. I am telling you because you deserve to know what you would be saying yes to if you said yes." Hester was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Warren, I left Caldwell to build a school in a settlement that had none. I have been teaching children to read in a single-room schoolhouse with a leaking roof for 2 years, because I believed it was worth doing. I am not afraid of work, and I am not afraid of a hard life, and I am not afraid of staying in one place." She looked at him steadily. "I left Caldwell. I did not leave the land. I love the land. I love the grass and the sky and the way the light looks in October and the sound the wind makes at night. I am not Ruth Alderman." Something in Warren's chest released, slow and complete, like a knot untied. "No," he said, "you are not." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. She turned her hand and held his, and they sat like that in the firelight for a long moment, not saying anything more, because what needed to be said had been said, and what needed to be felt was being felt, quietly and completely and without any performance at all. Christmas came and went in a way that was different from the Christmases of the past years, warmer and more inhabited. Hester spent the day at the homestead, and they ate a proper dinner at the table that Warren had set with the good dishes his mother had brought from Tennessee. And afterward they walked out in the snow to stand at the grave site, and Warren talked to his father for the first time since the funeral. Not in the broken, private way he had talked during those first terrible days, but in an ordinary, conversational way, telling him about the work that had been done on the south fence and the condition of the cattle and the way the cottonwood had taken the winter. And then he said, without planning to, "I think I am going to be all right, Pa, I have got good company." And he felt Hester's hand slip through his arm, and he covered it with his other hand, and they stood in the white and quiet afternoon together. In January of 1880, Warren spoke to Hester's father. Josiah Beckett had run his dry goods store in Caldwell for 30 years and was a small, precise man with a sharp mind and an old-fashioned belief in the proper doing of things. Warren rode into Caldwell on a clear, cold morning, went to the store, bought a bag of coffee he did not particularly need, and then said, straightforwardly, what he had come to say. Josiah Beckett listened without interrupting, which Warren appreciated. Then he asked several practical questions: the state of the homestead, its acreage and debt, Warren's plans for its continued maintenance and improvement. Warren answered each one honestly, including the fact that the first year without his father was going to be financially lean. Josiah looked at him for a long moment and then said, "My daughter is not a woman who makes decisions lightly, and she is not a woman who can be directed into or out of a thing she has made up her mind about. I want you to understand that going in." "I know that," Warren said. "It is one of the things I most admire about her." Josiah's mouth moved in something that was almost a smile. "All right," he said. "You have my blessing, whatever good it will do you, since she will decide herself anyway." Warren rode home feeling lighter than he had in months. He asked her the following Saturday. He did not make it into a production. Hester was not a woman who required productions and would likely have been made uncomfortable by one. He waited until after supper, when they were sitting by the fire in the comfortable, easy way they had settled into, and he said her name in that particular deliberate tone that she had come to recognize, and she looked at him. "I want to spend my life with you," he said. "I want you beside me on this land, and I want to work this life together with you. And I want to know that every evening when the work is done, you will be the one I come inside to." He paused. "I do not have much to offer that is eloquent. I have this homestead and these acres, and the intention to build something good on them for the rest of my years. And I have the absolute certainty, which I do not say lightly because I am not a man who says things lightly, that you are the person I want to build it with." He looked at her steadily. "Will you marry me, Hester?" She looked at him across the fire-lit room, and her eyes were very bright, and for a moment he thought she might cry, and then the expression on her face settled into something that was warm and clear and entirely certain, the same expression she had worn when she told the council she was going to stand up and fight for her school. "Yes," she said. "Warren, yes." He crossed to where she sat and took both her hands and pulled her to her feet, and she came up easily, smiling, and he kissed her for the first time, in the warm firelight of the house that his father had built, with the prairie wind outside and the clock ticking on the shelf, and she kissed him back with a warmth and a wholeness that made it feel like something long overdue, like rain after a drought, like something the land itself had been waiting for. They married in April. The wedding was held in the Caldwell church on a Saturday when the spring had finally and irrevocably arrived, when the prairie was turning green, and the sky was the particular brilliant blue it only achieves in the first weeks after winter releases its hold. Hester wore her mother's dress, let out slightly at the shoulders because she was broader there than her mother had been, and she had put prairie wildflowers in her hair because she had always thought the formality of veils was somewhat excessive, and besides, the flowers were just outside the door of the church, and it seemed foolish not to use them. Warren stood at the front of the church in his best shirt and his clean boots and watched her walk down the aisle, and felt the same thing he had felt on those evenings watching her ride away down the trail, multiplied by everything he now knew about her, which was considerable, and by everything he did not yet know about her, which was the part he was most looking forward to. Josiah Beckett walked his daughter to the front of the church with the careful deliberateness of a man who is being very precise about holding himself together. And when he put her hand in Warren's, he held both their hands for a moment and looked at Warren with an expression that communicated, more clearly than any words, the weight of what was being passed from one set of hands to another. The vows were the traditional ones, spoken by both of them in clear and steady voices, because neither of them was the kind of person who stumbled over a thing they had decided to do. Roy Briggs, who had been coming out twice a week to help with the heavy work and had become a kind of fixture at the homestead, stood in the second row with his hat against his chest, looking moved in the way that young men look moved when they have not yet learned to pretend otherwise. Several of Hester's students were there with their parents, the small ones sitting very straight and looking at their teacher in her wedding dress with wide, reverent eyes. At the reception in the churchyard, with tables brought out into the April sunshine, and enough food to feed a regiment, courtesy of the combined cooking of every woman in the Beckett and Redmond social orbit, Warren found a moment when Hester was laughing with one of her former students, a girl of about 9 who was telling her something with tremendous earnestness, and he simply stood and watched her, and felt the particular solidity of a happiness that is real and earned, that has been built rather than found, that knows something about grief and weather, and the long plain work of staying present and choosing to remain. She caught his eye across the yard, and the laugh softened into a smile, a private one, just for him, and he felt it in his chest the way he had felt her laugh that first time on the dark November road. Like sunlight. They settled into their life together the way two rivers join, with a brief turbulence and then a deepening current that was stronger than either had been alone. Hester had given up her position at the settlement school to move to the homestead, and this had cost her something real, which Warren understood and did not minimize. She did not complain about it, but he knew the school was more than a job to her. It was something she had built, something she had fought for, and leaving it was not a small thing. In the months after the wedding, he watched her sometimes in the afternoons, looking south across the prairie in the direction of her old settlement with an expression that was not regret exactly, but was something adjacent to it, a wistfulness that she carried quietly and did not make into a burden. He began, without telling her what he was doing, to make some inquiries. Caldwell had a school, but it was underfunded, and its current teacher, a man of 50 who had been at it for 20 years, had recently expressed his intention to retire in the fall. Warren spoke to several of the town's more prominent figures, merchants and landowners and the pastor, men who had the town's ear. He spoke to them about the importance of quality education. He mentioned, in passing, that his wife happened to have 2 years of successful experience running exactly such a school. He did not make it into a campaign, because that was not how things worked in Caldwell in 1880, and it was not how Hester would have wanted it done. He simply planted seeds and let the ground do the rest. By July, there was a formal offer from Caldwell's school board, a 2-room schoolhouse, funded properly, with a decent salary and the freedom to set her own curriculum within reasonable limits. The ride from the homestead to Caldwell was 40 minutes on a good horse. Not nothing, but manageable. When he told her, they were sitting on the porch in the summer evening, and he watched her face go through about 6 different expressions in rapid succession, starting with surprise and moving through something that looked like it might become tears and settling into a bright, fierce happiness that she turned on him with a directness that almost made him step back. "You did this," she said. "I mentioned some things to some people," he said. "Warren Redmond," she said, and the way she said his name full and warm was a thing he would remember for the rest of his life. "Will you take it?" he asked. She was across the porch and had her arms around him before he finished the question, and he caught her and held her, and she pressed her face against his shoulder for a moment and said, muffled by his shirt, "Yes, "Of course I will take it. How did you know?" "You look south sometimes," he said simply. "In the afternoons." She pulled back and looked at him, and her eyes were wet, and she did not seem particularly bothered by that. "I thought I was being subtle." "You are almost always subtle," he said. "I pay attention." She laughed, wet-eyed and radiant, and kissed him soundly, and the summer evening moved around them with its warm, indifferent beauty. August brought with it a dry spell that threatened the late corn and required long days of hauling water from the creek, and Roy Briggs was an invaluable partner in that labor. Roy was 22 that summer, sandy-haired and good-natured, and possessed of an inexhaustible capacity for hard work that Warren deeply respected. He had been coming out to the homestead since shortly after Elias died, and by now he was as much a fixture as the barn cat, eating supper with them most evenings and sleeping in the small room off the barn that Elias had used for storage, and that Warren had cleared out and furnished with a cot and a lamp. One evening Roy came to supper with an expression that was transparently trying to be casual and failing entirely, and both Warren and Hester noticed it and exchanged a look over his head. "All right," Hester said, putting a plate in front of him with a maternal practicality that she deployed as naturally as breathing. "What is it?" Roy colored to the roots of his hair. "Nothing," he said. "Roy," Warren said. A pause. Roy turned his fork over in his hand. "There is a girl," he said with the air of a man confessing to something. "There generally is," Hester said pleasantly. "She is the Hawkins girl, from the north side of town, Myra Hawkins." Warren and Hester exchanged another look. Myra Hawkins was a sensible, good-humored girl of 20 with a gift for making things grow and a father who was somewhat protective. "And," Warren prompted. "And I do not know how to," Roy gestured vaguely with his fork. "I do not know what to say." Hester sat down at the table with her own plate and looked at Roy with the calm clarity of someone who has thought a great deal about how people ought to conduct themselves with one another. "You say what is true," she said. "You say that you find her company valuable and that you have been thinking about her and that you would like to spend more time together, and then you let her respond honestly. That is all there is to it." "That is all there is to it," Roy said doubtfully. "The rest of it," Hester said, "happens naturally when two people are honest with each other early on." Roy looked at Warren, the way younger men look at older men when they want confirmation. Warren kept his face very straight. "She is right," he said. "That is exactly how it works." Roy looked between them, and then he looked at the table, and then he said, "Did you tell her that you found her company valuable?" "I told her I had been thinking about her constantly," Warren said, "for 2 months." Roy's eyebrows rose. "And that worked." "She was already thinking the same thing," Hester said, and her smile was the quiet, pleased smile of someone recounting a good memory. Roy appeared to find this deeply encouraging. He went to speak to Myra Hawkins the following Saturday, and the Saturday after that Myra arrived at the homestead with her father, who turned out to be quite reasonable once he had spoken to Warren. And by September Roy was walking with Myra after church on Sundays with the careful, earnest happiness of a young man who cannot quite believe his luck. Warren watched this and felt a fond satisfaction that he kept to himself, or tried to, until Hester caught him smiling at Roy and Myra's retreating backs one Sunday afternoon and said, with gentle mock severity, "Are you being sentimental?" "Absolutely not," he said. "You are," she said. "I am not." She slipped her hand into his and leaned her head briefly against his shoulder as they walked back to where the horses were tied. "It is a very good thing about you," she said softly. He held her hand tighter and said nothing, which was also, sometimes, how he said everything. Hester started her position at the Caldwell School in September of 1880, and the effect on her was visible and immediate. She left early in the mornings with an energy that was different from ordinary morning energy, a particular forward-leaning alertness that meant she was moving towards something she cared about. She came home in the evenings full of stories about her students and what they had done that day, and she told them with a delight that was entirely unself-conscious, and Warren listened to all of them and never once looked bored, because he was not, because watching her talk about the thing she loved was its own specific pleasure. The school had 31 students that first year, ranging in age from 5 to 14. There were children whose parents were farmers and children whose parents were merchants and children whose parents were the Mexican workers who had come north following the cattle trade. And Hester taught them all with the same seriousness of purpose and the same fundamental belief that every child in front of her was worth the effort of reaching. This was not universally popular. One family withdrew their children in October because they did not think it appropriate for their daughters to sit alongside the children of laborers. Hester expressed her views on this privately to Warren one evening with a feeling and a precision that he found both righteous and somewhat bracing, and then she went back the next morning and did her work. Her relationship with Gerald Fitch's equivalent in Caldwell, a man named Bernard Colley who sat on the school board and had strong opinions about efficiency, was a recurring source of friction. He came to inspect the school twice in the first year, both times with the air of a man looking for fault and slightly frustrated not to find it. Hester received him with perfect professional courtesy and answered every question he asked with data and documentation, and did not, Warren noted when she told him about it, allow herself to be needled into saying anything that could be used against her. She had learned, in her years of dealing with men like Gerald Fitch, to keep her anger very clean and very precise, to never waste it on performances when it could be put to better use. He asked me whether I thought Homer was appropriate for 12-year-olds, she told Warren one evening with a particular tone in her voice. What did you say? I told him that the first thing Homer teaches you is that the consequences of pride and selfishness tend to be catastrophic, and that this seems like a relevant lesson for young people to encounter early. A pause. He did not have a great deal to say to that. Warren looked at her with the steady, warm admiration that was, by now, one of the most constant things in his life. I love you, he said. She looked up from the papers she had been grading, and the expression on her face shifted, as it always did when he said that, into something that was unguarded and very warm. I love you too, she said, and she put down her papers and came to where he sat by the fire and settled herself into the chair beside his, close enough that their arms touched, and they sat like that in the comfortable, complete intimacy of two people who have built something real together, while the October wind moved along the eaves and the clock ticked on the shelf. Winter came again, the second winter since Elias had died, and it was different from the first in every way that mattered. The house was not hollow anymore. It had sound and warmth, and the presence of another person moving through it, the smell of Hester's tea on the kitchen shelf, and her books stacked on the side table she had claimed as hers, and the sound of her voice in the mornings when she was talking to the chickens while she gathered eggs, which she did with an easy friendliness toward the chickens that Warren found very funny, and would not say so because he knew she would just shrug and tell him chickens appreciated being spoken to, which was probably true. Roy came to dinner most Sundays, sometimes with Myra, who was becoming a fixture of her own, and these Sunday dinners were the kind of full, loud, cheerful affairs that Warren had not known the Homestead could produce. Josiah Beckett came out from Caldwell several times over the winter, and these visits were good for Hester in a way that was evident even though she did not talk about it much, the particular nourishment of being known by a parent, of having your history present in the room. One evening in December, when Josiah had come for supper, and was sitting by the fire afterward with his coffee, Warren watched him and Hester talking in the unself-conscious way of people who have known each other a very long time, the shorthand and the old jokes and the comfortable silences between the sentences, and he felt something that was not envy exactly but was something like it, a wistfulness for his own father that had not dulled as much as people had promised it would. It was different from grief at this distance. It was more like a constant low awareness, like knowing a room is empty even when you are not in it. After Josiah had gone and they were clearing the table, Hester said, "You miss him tonight." "I always miss him," Warren said, Tonight is just one of the nights when it comes through more clearly. She stopped with a stack of plates in her hands and looked at him. Tell me something about him I do not know. He could not carry a tune to save his life, Warren said after a moment. But he sang anyway, every Sunday morning while he did the milking. You could hear him from the yard. Completely off-key, not a note of self-consciousness about it. He just sang. Hester smiled, slow and warm. What did he sing? Old hymns mostly. Same as my mother, only considerably less tuneful. Warren set down the plate he was holding and leaned against the kitchen table. They were a good pair that way. They were each other's best thing. You could always tell. Hester set down her own plates and came to him and put her arms around his waist and laid her cheek against his chest. And he held her. And they stood in the kitchen for a long time without saying anything else. The house quiet around them and the winter moving outside the windows. And Warren felt the grief and the gratitude and the love all wrapped up together the way they tend to be when you are paying attention, inseparable from each other, each one making the others more real. Spring came early that year, 1881, and with it, a development that neither of them had announced to anyone but which had been making itself felt for about 2 months and was now undeniable. Hester told him on a Sunday morning in March, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around her cup in the way she had when she was about to say something careful. She said it plainly, looking at him across the table with those clear green eyes, and he looked at her for a moment in complete silence, and then he got up and went around the table and crouched down in front of her chair and took her face in his hands and kissed her forehead with a gentleness that was entirely unlike his usual self and entirely exactly right. "Are you all right?" he asked, pulling back to look at her. "Very," she said, and there was a brightness in her face that was new and different and very beautiful. "And the school?" he asked, because he knew she would want him to ask. "I can continue through June," she said, "possibly July. And I have already been thinking about whether a part-time arrangement might be possible in the fall, or whether there is someone who could take the primary role." She paused, with a look that was humorously exasperated at herself. "While I figure out how to do 2 extremely large things at once." "You will figure it out," he said. "You always do." She touched his face and her hand was warm. "You are very confident in me." "I have very good reasons to be," he said simply. He told Roy that same day, and Roy's reaction was so uncontainedly delighted that he actually knocked over the bucket he was carrying, which startled the barn cat and the nearest cow in equal measure. And Hester heard the commotion from the kitchen window and looked out to see Roy apologizing extravagantly to both animals and Warren standing nearby with his arms crossed, trying not to laugh. The summer of 1880 moved with a particular beauty, or perhaps it was that Warren was paying attention to it with a specificity he had not previously brought to summers. He noticed the way the light fell in the mornings across the kitchen table where Hester sat with her papers. He noticed the sound of her laughter when something Roy said surprised it out of her. He noticed the way she moved around the homestead with a growing and easy ownership, as though every fence post and water trough had become part of her in the way they were part of him. And the recognition of this moved him in ways he did not try to put into words, only into action, into the extra care he took with the house and the land, into the things he built and fixed and improved, all of it a conversation with the future. Myra Hawkins came in July to announce that she and Roy intended to marry, and this news was met with the dinner party it deserved. Roy sat at the table looking as though he had been personally responsible for a miracle, and Myra, who was a very sensible girl, sat beside him and ate her supper and accepted congratulations with a warmth that was genuine and unperformed. And Hester caught Warren's eye across the table with an expression that said, quite plainly, "I told him to be honest with her and he was, and look what happened." And Warren replied with a slight raise of his eyebrow that said, quite equally plainly, "I know you did and you were right." And the entire exchange lasted about a second and a half and contained more actual communication than most conversations last 20 minutes. Roy and Myra married in August in a simple ceremony in Caldwell's church, and Warren stood up as Roy's man, and Hester sat in the front row, by now considerably and obviously expecting, and looked at the two young people exchanging their vows with an expression of such genuine and uncomplicated happiness that Warren, standing at the front of the church, looked across the room at her at the moment Roy said "I do," and felt the whole weight of his life. All the grief and the work and the love and the accumulating days, and found it not heavy but right, not a burden but the particular and irreplaceable substance of a life being fully lived. In September, 3 weeks before Hester's students were due back for the new school year, their son was born. It was not a smooth or easy labor, and the hours were long, and Warren spent most of them in the adjacent room being absolutely useless, which was one of the more difficult experiences of his adult life. The midwife, a woman named Pearl Dawson who had delivered half the children in Caldwell, came and went from the room with a calm efficiency that Warren found simultaneously reassuring and maddening. Roy sat with him for part of it, and then had the sense to go do something productive with himself, leaving Warren to wear a path back and forth across the kitchen floor. When Pearl Dawson opened the door and said, "Come in now," her voice had the particular tone of good news delivered to someone who has been waiting long enough, and Warren went in. Hester was in the bed with her hair loose and dark against the pillow, and an expression of such pure exhaustion and such pure radiance simultaneously that it should have been contradictory and was not, was instead the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. And in her arms was a small, wrinkled, furiously alive person who had his hair and her eyes, and a personality that was already making itself clear through the quality of the noise he was producing. Warren sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son and did not say anything for a long time, because there was nothing to say that was adequate to the moment, and Hester, who understood him, did not expect him to say anything. She just shifted slightly, and he put his arm around her, and she leaned against him, and they looked at the boy together, the way they had looked at many things together since that first afternoon on the porch, side by side, without pretense. "Thomas," Hester said. "For your father, if you agree." Warren's throat tightened. He looked at her. "If you agree," she said again, gently. "Thomas Elias Redmond," he said, and his voice was not entirely steady, and he did not try to make it so. She nodded, satisfied, and looked back at the baby, and Warren pressed his lips against her hair and held them there for a moment and felt everything, all of it, the loss and the love and the continuing, the way life insists on moving forward even through grief, especially through grief, and how the people you love can teach you to let it. The weeks after Thomas arrived were their own particular kind of beautiful chaos. Hester, who had approached everything in her life with systematic competence, found that infants do not respond well to systematic competence, and told Warren this with a faint air of personal affront, while Thomas screamed at 3 in the morning for reasons that neither of them could identify. Warren, who had been around livestock his entire life and was accustomed to creatures with needs that defied logic, was considerably more equable about the whole thing, which Hester found irritating at 2 in the morning and endearing in daylight. He took Thomas in the evening so that Hester could sleep, sitting in the old pine rocker on the porch with the baby against his chest, and he talked to him in the low, unhurried voice he used with the horses, and Thomas, who may have had the soul of a small horse, generally stopped screaming within a few minutes. Hester watched this from the doorway one October evening, her hair loose and her expression soft with tiredness and love, and said, "How are you doing that?" "Talking to him," Warren said. "About what?" He considered. "Currently, the late corn and the state of the north fence, and the fact that Roy has been letting the cattle drift too far toward the creek." He looked up at her with a slight smile. "He seems interested." Hester laughed, and it was the unguarded, warm laugh that still did to him what it had done on that dark November road 2 years ago, and she came out and sat in her chair beside his, the one that had been her chair since that first afternoon 3 months after the funeral, the one she had simply claimed by sitting in it and had never been asked to vacate. and they sat together in the October evening with their son between them, the prairie dark and wide around the house that Elias Redmond had built. The stars extravagant overhead, the clock ticking inside. The fall settled into winter and winter into the spring of 1882, and the homestead grew and changed in the way that homesteads do when they are properly tended and properly loved. Warren extended the house that spring, adding a room on the east side with a new window that caught the morning light. For Thomas, though Thomas was not yet large enough to appreciate the morning light and was primarily interested in the barn cat, whom he had recently discovered and pursued with a single-mindedness that recalled his mother at her most determined. Hester had gone back to the school in the spring on the part-time arrangement she had negotiated, 2 days a week initially, and then 3 as Thomas grew more robust, and Pearl Dawson's niece, a capable girl of 17 named Agatha, came to sit with him on school days. The arrangement worked well, and Hester moved between school and homestead with the easy competence of a woman who has found all the pieces of her life and arranged them in a way that serves them all. Bernard Colley came to inspect the school again in March and found it, by any objective measure, excellent, and managed to convey this in a way that contained only about 40% of the usual implicit reluctance, which Hester counted as progress. Roy and Myra had built their own small house on a piece of land Warren sold them on the east side of the homestead, and this arrangement was mutually beneficial in every respect. Roy was still close enough to help with the heavy work. Myra and Hester had developed the kind of friendship that grows between neighboring women who respect each other and have practical reason to help each other, and the two households formed a small community on the edge of the vast Kansas prairie that had, in its domestic completeness, something of the feeling of a town unto itself. Myra was expecting by summer, and Roy walked around with an expression of perpetual wonder that made Warren feel both fond and ancient, though he was 30 years old. "You looked like that," Hester told him one evening, apparently following his thoughts. "I did not look like that," Warren said. "You looked exactly like that. Pearl Dawson told you that Thomas was healthy, and you just stood there holding him with your mouth slightly open. That is not looking like Roy." "It is entirely looking like Roy," she said, and she was smiling over her mending with a warmth that made the whole room feel warmer. He reached across and put his hand over hers, the way he had across the kitchen table in December of their first winter together, the gesture that had started something that kept starting and kept going and showed no sign of doing anything else. Summer came again. Thomas, at almost 1 year old, had become a small, determined person who had both his mother's clarity and his father's stubbornness, which combination meant that life with him was consistently interesting. He had his grandmother Clara's eyes, which Warren noticed one morning in the summer light, and which made him stand for a moment in the kitchen door with Thomas in his arms, looking at those gray-green eyes with a feeling that was nothing so sharp as grief anymore, just something tender and ongoing, the recognition of continuation. He took Thomas out to the grave site on Sunday mornings sometimes, the way his father had taken him to his grandmother's grave as a boy, and talked to the markers in the ordinary conversational way he had adopted since that Christmas Day 2 years ago. He told his father about Thomas, about the things the boy was doing and learning, about the school and Hester and Roy and Myra, about the improvements to the homestead and the condition of the land. He did not know if his father heard any of it. He did not think it mattered whether he did or not. The talking was for him as much as for his father, a way of keeping the conversation going across a distance that was, after all, not insurmountable by any means available to the living, but that need not mean silence. Hester came out to join him sometimes, with her own words and her own quietness, and sometimes she simply stood beside him with her hand through his arm the way she had on that October afternoon long ago, when she had straightened his mother's marker and asked him to tell her about Clara. He had given her, Warren thought sometimes in those long, quiet summer evenings, everything. Not in the grand, dramatic way of stories, not in the way of sacrifice and surrender, but in the real way, which was 1,000 small days and 1,000 small choices, the decision each morning to be present and honest and to pay attention. And she had given him the same. And between the two of them, in the doing of it, they had made something that was stronger and more complete than either of them was alone, something that had held up against grief and weather, and all the ordinary and extraordinary difficulties that the plains threw at a life. He thought about the porch. He thought about the afternoon she had appeared out of the tall grass on her horse and climbed the 2 steps and sat down beside him without a word, and how that single act, so simple and so carefully considered, had changed everything. He thought about the fact that he had been sitting on that porch waiting for something without knowing he was waiting, and she had arrived, and whatever it was that needed to start had started. On a clear evening in late August, with Thomas asleep in his new room and the prairie going gold in the long light and the cottonwood behind the grave site moving slowly in the warm air, Warren and Hester sat together on the porch in the 2 old chairs that had been theirs, his and hers, for as long as either of them could now reasonably separate from the idea of this place. It was quiet in the particular way of late summer evenings on the plains, which is never truly silent but is a full and layered quiet, the grass and the insects and the distant sound of cattle and somewhere south a coyote testing the evening air. The clock ticked inside the house. Hester had her hands in her lap and her eyes on the horizon where the sky was going orange, and then red, and then that particular final shade of dark gold before the blue of evening came. "Do you remember the first day?" she asked, not a sad question, a fond one. "You sat down and did not say anything," he said. "I did not know what to say," she said. "I had been trying to think of the right words the whole ride out and none of them were right. So you said nothing." "So I said nothing," she agreed. "It seemed better." He looked at the horizon. "It was better." She turned her head and looked at him with those green eyes that he had been looking at for 3 years now, which was not very long in the grand scale and was at the same time the exact and entire length of his life as it had come to mean anything to him. "I was afraid," she said, "that morning. I was afraid you would not want company. I was afraid you would send me away." "I thought about it," he said honestly, her mouth curved. "I know, I could see you thinking about it. And you sat there anyway." "And I sat there anyway," she said, "because you needed someone to sit there, and I wanted to be the one to do it." He reached across the space between the 2 chairs and took her hand, and she gave it to him and turned her palm against his, and they sat with the warm weight of the evening around them, and the first stars appearing in the east and the sound of the sleeping land and the sleeping child and all the living, ongoing, unglamorous, irreplaceable fullness of a life they had chosen together. "I am glad you came," he said. "I know," she said. "I could always tell." They sat on the porch while the last of the light left the sky and the stars came out in their full extravagance, the same stars that had always been there, indifferent and beautiful and constant, over the prairie and the homestead, and the 2 people sitting in the old pine rockers with their hands joined across the space between them. The evening was warm. The grass moved. Inside the house, the clock ticked. Roy's son was born in October, healthy and loud, and Roy appeared at the homestead the morning after to announce it with an expression of such undiluted joy that even Warren could not maintain the straight face he attempted. And Hester kissed Roy on the cheek and told him he had done very well, which made him color and grin. And then they all went to see Myra, who was already sitting up in bed looking serene, and rather pleased with herself, which seemed to Warren entirely justified. The 2 households moved through the autumn in the comfortable, productive rhythm they had established, neighboring and working and sharing meals, and watching the children grow, Roy's boy a few weeks behind Thomas in everything but volume, in which department he had a significant advantage. Hester's school in Caldwell continued to be, by every measure available, excellent. The enrollment had grown to 43 students by the fall of 1882, and the school board, including a somewhat softened Bernard Colley, authorized a second teacher. The woman Hester hired, a sharp young person named Dorothea Carr, who had come from Ohio with more education than opportunity, reminded Warren slightly of Hester herself at the beginning, and he could see Hester recognizing this and taking a particular care with Dorothea that was both generosity and the specific satisfaction of a woman who has fought for a thing, and now has the space to help someone else fight for it too. The injustice of it was not lost on either of them. The constant negotiating and justifying and proving that a woman was worth listening to. The way competence and evidence and plain excellence were never quite enough to simply be allowed to exist without challenge. Hester did not stop being angry about it. She kept the anger clean and put it to work, in the care she gave her students and the firmness with which she conducted her professional affairs, and the conversations she had in the evenings with Warren about what the world ought to look like and why it did not yet look that way. He listened to all of it. He thought she was right about most of it. He tried, in the small practical ways available to him, to act as though she was right, which was perhaps the most useful thing he could do. Warren expanded the homestead operation that fall, purchasing a small additional parcel from a neighbor who was moving his family to Colorado, and the added acreage meant added work, but also added possibility. Ground that could be put to wheat the following spring and would, in a few years, substantially improve the homestead's output. He and Roy planned it out over several evenings at the kitchen table with a map and a lamp, and Hester's occasional interjections, which were always more useful than either of them admitted in the moment, and which they invariably followed. The winter of 1882 going into 1883 was the coldest anyone in the county remembered in 20 years. The snows came in December and did not stop for weeks, and the plains took on the appearance of a different country entirely, white and still, and vast in a way that was beautiful and utterly unforgiving. Warren and Roy worked the winter work with the disciplined, steady effort of men who know the land is not sentimental about human difficulty, and the women managed the households with the same practical understanding that comfort is a thing you create, not a thing you wait for. There were long evenings those winter months when the dark came early, and the cold pressed against the windows and the fire in the hearth was the whole world, and Warren and Hester sat with Thomas between them and read aloud to each other, alternating chapters of whatever book was current, their voices in the warm room the most domestic and complete sound he could imagine. Thomas fell asleep against his mother's side, and Hester kept reading, her voice a little quieter but just as steady, and Warren watched the fire and listened to her read, and felt the snow on the other side of the glass as something not threatening but containing, holding them all inside the light and warmth of what they had made. When the spring of 1883 arriving in the sudden decisive way of Kansas springs, as though the land had simply made up its mind and immediately gotten on with it, Warren stood in the south field one morning in March and looked at the land going green around him, the winter rye coming up through the dark earth, the sky vast and blue and full of early birds, and felt something that was not happiness exactly, or not only happiness, but a deep and encompassing rightness. The feeling of being exactly where you are supposed to be, doing exactly what you are supposed to be doing, with exactly the people you are supposed to be doing it with. Hester came across the field to him, her boots dark with mud, a letter in her hand. She had ridden to Caldwell that morning for supplies and stopped at the post office. "From Wichita," she said, "the Teachers' Association." He took the letter and read it. She watched his face. "They want you to speak at their conference," he said. She nodded, watching him. "In June." He looked up at her. "Will you go?" "I want to," she said carefully. "Thomas will be almost 2. He will be fine with Myra and Agatha for a few days. But I wanted to." She paused, with a slight uncharacteristic hesitation. "You wanted to ask," he said. "I wanted to talk about it," she said, making the small but real distinction that was one of the ways she did things. He looked at her, this woman who had ridden out of the tall grass 3 years ago and sat down beside him without a word, who had straightened his mother's marker in the cold ground and made him wind the clock and fought for her school and borne his son and shared his mornings and filled his evenings and built with him, day by day and season by season, a life that was worth the building. "Go to Wichita," he said. "Say what you have to say. They are lucky to have you saying it." The brightness in her face was the same brightness he had seen on that December evening when he told her about the Caldwell School, just as warm and just as direct. "Come with me," she said. He looked at her. "I was not invited." "I am inviting you," she said. "I want you there." He stood in the green field with the spring moving around them, and he thought about his father, and the years Elias had never left these acres, and he thought about how the land would still be here when they came back, as it had always been, as it always would be, patient and constant in his, and he thought about Hester's voice reading in the firelight and the sound of her laugh in the dark on a November road. "All right," he said. They went to Wichita in June, leaving Thomas in Myra's very capable hands and riding the distance with the particular pleasure of two people who have grown so accustomed to each other's company that any new experience is enhanced simply by being shared. Wichita in 1883 was a different world from the Homestead and from Caldwell, a proper city by Kansas standards, with a railway station and hotels, and a bustle that was simultaneously exciting and faintly exhausting, and they navigated it together with the easy partnership that was theirs by now, Warren managing the practical logistics and Hester managing everything else. She spoke at the conference on the second day, in a large room with 120 people in it, school teachers and educators from across the state, and she stood at the front of that room and said the things she had been saying in various forms for years, about the equal worth of every child sitting in a schoolroom, about the importance of literature and language alongside arithmetic, about the need for women in education to be given the same professional standing and security as their male counterparts, about what schools could be if they were trusted to be what they were capable of being. She said it with the clarity and steadiness that were simply how she was in the world, without performance and without apology, and the room was very quiet while she spoke, and then it was not quiet at all. Warren stood at the back of the room and listened, and when she was done and the room was full of applause and response, he caught her eye across the heads of 120 people, and she looked at him and smiled, the same smile she had given him across the churchyard on their wedding day, private and warm and entirely for him. He made his way through the crowd to her side, which took some time as many people wanted to speak with her, and he waited with the patience of a man accustomed to waiting and perfectly happy doing so, and when he finally reached her, she took his arm and leaned toward his ear and said, "Was it good?" "Magnificent," he said, using the same word he had used after the council meeting, and she laughed the same way she had laughed then, surprised and pleased, and several people nearby looked at them with the slightly wondering expression that people sometimes directed at a man and woman who were visibly, unequivocally, and without any self-consciousness at all in love with each other. They came home to the homestead 2 days later, and Thomas ran to his mother with the tottering determination of a nearly 2-year-old, and she swept him up and held him against her shoulder, and looked at Warren over the boy's head with an expression of such simple and complete happiness that he stood in the yard and let it settle over him like sunlight. Roy was at the fence watching with the mild, contented expression of a man who has put down roots and likes where he planted them. Myra waved from the doorway of their house. "How was Wichita?" Roy asked. "Loud," Warren said. "Good loud or bad loud?" Warren looked at Hester with Thomas on her hip, walking toward the house she now knew as well as she knew anything in her life. "Good loud," he said. Summer of 1883 turned rich and long and full, and Hester found herself expecting again in the late weeks of it. News she brought to Warren one morning in August at the kitchen table with the same plain directness as before, looking at him over her coffee cup with an expression that held both the announcement and the question, and the certainty that whatever his response was, it would be the right one. He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached across and poured more coffee into her cup with a steady hand and said, "I will start the second room addition in September before the cold comes." She looked at him. He looked back at her. The morning light was on the table between them, and outside the window the summer was doing what summer does, going on with itself in its full and careless abundance. "I love you," she said. "I know," he said. "I love you too." He stood up and kissed the top of her head, and she caught his hand as he passed and held it for a moment, and he held hers, and then he went out to start the day. The second room addition went up in October and November, Warren and Roy working it together with a competence that came from years of working the same land side by side, understanding each other's methods, falling into the easy rhythm of men who trust each other's judgment and do not need to negotiate every decision aloud. The addition was solid and square, and Warren fitted the window himself, a large south-facing window that would let in the winter light, because Hester had mentioned once that she thought the house could use more light, and the mention was 3 years ago, but he had not forgotten it and never would. Thomas, at 2 years old, was deeply interested in the construction and was carried away from it approximately 40 times over the course of the project. He had by now his own established character, his mother's directness and his father's stubbornness, and a capacity for delight in ordinary things that seemed to belong entirely to himself, a bright particular quality that neither of them could account for by inheritance but simply received with gratitude. The child was born in the early spring of 1884, on a morning when the last snow was still on the ground but the first pale shoots of the winter rye were visible through it, the old and new together, ending and beginning. It was a girl. Warren held her in the early light of the bedroom window while Hester slept the deep, earned sleep of labor's aftermath, and he looked at this small person who had his mother's coloring and nobody's features yet, being too new for that, and felt the same complete helplessness and complete love that Thomas had produced in him, perhaps slightly different because she was different, or perhaps he was different, or both. "Eleanor," Hester had said before she slept. "My grandmother's name." Eleanor Redmond slept in his arms in the early spring light, and Warren stood at the window and looked out at the land, the stubborn green coming up through the last of the winter, the south field and the north fence and the cottonwood by the grave site beginning its first cautious buds, and felt the full, accumulated weight of his life as the gift that it was. Thomas woke later that morning and was brought in to see his sister, and regarded her with the solemn and slightly suspicious expression of a 2-year-old confronting a significant change to his circumstances. Then she made a sound, a small, unintelligible but emphatic sound, and Thomas looked at her with sudden interest and put out one finger and touched her hand with great care. And Hester, awake again and watching from the bed, made a sound of her own, soft and delighted, and Warren looked between his daughter and his son and his wife and felt, with a clarity that was almost like pain, the specific and unrepeatable goodness of this moment. This ordinary, extraordinary moment in the spring of 1884, in a house on the Kansas prairie that a man named Elias Redmond had built by hand 40 years ago, and that was, in every way that mattered, the right place to be. Spring became summer. The wheat came up in the new field and the garden grew, and the school year ended with a celebration in the schoolyard that Hester organized with her usual productive exactness, and Thomas began to walk the distance to the Redmond boundary fence on his own, which was, by general agreement, too far, and returned each time with mud on his boots, and a satisfaction that Warren recognized very specifically as his own quality reflected back at him. Eleanor grew with the appetite and efficiency of a healthy child, and was by summer a substantial small person, with opinions that she communicated with impressive force for someone who had, as yet, limited vocabulary. Roy and Myra's boy, James, was a year older and regarded Eleanor with the wary respect of someone who has been around long enough to know a force of nature when he sees one. In the evenings, with both children asleep and the long prairie dark settling in, Warren and Hester sat on the porch in the old chairs, sometimes talking and sometimes not, and the silence between them was the best kind of silence, the kind that is not empty but full of everything that has been said and everything that does not need to be said, full of the life that moves through a house and a household and a marriage when all three are properly tended. The stars came out over the Kansas plains the way they always had, in their full and extravagant numbers, and the grass moved in the warm night air, and somewhere a coyote made its comment on the dark, and the clock ticked inside the house. Warren looked at the sky and thought about his father and his mother and everything they had built and left behind, and he thought about the morning of the funeral and the 3 days afterward and the sound of a horse coming up the trail, and the 2 steps up onto the porch, and the woman who had sat down beside him in his mother's chair without a word. He had not known, that afternoon, what was beginning. He had only known that the silence had changed, that something in the quality of his solitude had shifted, and that wherever that shift was leading, it was leading somewhere. He knew now where it had led. "What are you thinking about?" Hester asked, in the quiet way she asked things without demanding. "That afternoon," he said. "The porch." She turned her head and looked at him, and in the starlight her face was both familiar and new, the way a landscape looks different in different lights while remaining exactly itself. "I was terrified," she said, "in case you want to know. I thought you were the most certain person I had ever seen," he said. "I know," she said with a small smile. "That is because I was terrified and I was not going to show it." He looked at her. "What were you afraid of?" "That you would send me away," she said. "That you would want to be alone and I would have to ride back down that trail having accomplished nothing, and you would be alone on the porch for another 3 days or another 30, and there would be nothing I could do about it. And if I had sent you away," she was quiet for a moment looking at the stars, "I would have come back," she said. "Eventually. I would have found another reason to come out." A pause. "I was fairly determined." He looked at her with a warmth and an admiration that was the most constant thing he knew, more constant than the weather or the price of wheat or anything else the plains could produce. "I know," he said. "It is one of the things I most love about you." She took his hand in the dark, and they sat together on the porch of the house that Elias had built, in the 2 chairs that had become their chairs, in the dark and the starlight and the warm Kansas night, with their children sleeping inside and their friends in the neighboring house and their fields growing in the dark and their whole lives, everything they had built and everything that was still becoming, stretching out around them in every direction like the prairie itself, wide and full and theirs. The clock ticked. The grass moved. The stars held their positions, patient and unchanging over everything. And the 2 of them sat, side by side, the way they had begun, saying nothing because nothing needed to be said, together on the porch in the good and quiet fullness of the life they had made.